Welcome and good evening. My name is Gabeba Baderoon and welcome to the literary tribute to Zoë Wicomb. I have to say thank you first of all to Desiree Lewis, whose email initiated and the form of this evening, and also to Clarks in the person of Henrietta Dax, who is a beloved and dear friend of Zoë Wicomb's for decades, and to Andrea, who is now the new Henrietta, I suppose, and right. So I wrote a piece just because it's better for my brain, and this is an introduction to a series of literary honorings of Zoë by people whose names I will mention, but particularly representing the people who have read her work and who teach her work, and the people who have done those things and are also her friends. Our Zoë, beloved Zoë, dear Zoë. When I wrote to friends to let them know the impossible news on October 14th, Siraj Rasool, Victor Dlamini, Prima Shilalu, Grace Musila, Rustum Hussain couldn't write her name without saying what she was to them: a dear person, a beloved person, our person. When I first wrote to them, I deleted the term passed on and wrote instead, died last night. I intuited that Zoë wouldn't approve of passing's avoidance of the difficulty of saying the word death. And days later, I received this from Gertrude Fester. What utter nonsense this passing on is. Passing on where to? When you are dead, you just die, full stop. This is last year, pondering someone else. I intuited this about Zoë because she made me a better reader and eventually a writer. I think about what I'm avoiding and what I'm facing when I read Zoë. And despite the full stop, thank God, she also punctuated death differently. She punctured it and made it less finite. The last time we wrote to each other was on September 16th, in anticipating of seeing each other in Stellenbosch a couple of Sundays ago on November the 2nd at the Nobel in Africa Symposium. She wrote because she was the patron of New Contrast, about which she wrote, New Contrast has for decades and throughout the benighted years been a cultural beacon in South Africa. In its showcasing of creativity, and especially new writing, it has been an inspiration to art lovers and formative for many writers. She wrote that to help us keep New Contrast going. So on a passing note, please subscribe. If, like me, you have been rereading Zoë Wicomb for the past few weeks, then you will have found the pleasures of coming again to a piece of writing. Angelo Fick, who will speak next, has a library in which the books are double-stacked, books in the front and books at the back. And he rereads certain books each year, Middlemarch and longer. And if, like him, you come again to a piece of writing, or to an author's entire earth, you will notice patterns dancing across different books. And of those piercing images alighting here and then again there, something will linger with you and find its place in your memory, in your permanent sense of the world and what you do in it. Zoë's writing was like that. And reading for the past few weeks, she loved whitewashed walls because they come again and again. We all know that she loved red and gold and green cellophane because they are like butterflies from You Can't Get Lost in Cape Town to David's story to Still Life. She loved absences. She deliberates on absences and on presence in the most extraordinary way. It was illuminating to meet Zoe and also encounter the facets of her. Her magnificence, of course. I first saw her walking in the 90s along what was then Jamison Avenue, University of Cape Town. Blazing, luminous. I saw also how composed she was. Her voice was very composed. Her writing when she spoke in public was very composed. And she composed herself. She worked at that because it wasn't easy. Writing and public speaking often left her in agony. But there was also another aspect to her. Already by the time she published You Can't Get Lost in Cape Town in 1987, she already had a fully formed writer's consciousness. And then I speak a little bit about cellophane and the absence. But about absence, which is across David's story, I think one of the many reasons that is the most singular book for me of that period, which, as you know, is the book that turns the century and the millennium for us. She speaks about absence in that book. Just in one instance, for instance, when she's contemplating the face of a black-eyed Susan, which she calls black-eyed Susies, which devolves to a point of nothingness. And then she deliberates on the meaning of absence, nothingness. And now, of course, we are facing the longest absence of all, death. Death which is not a full stop, it just punctuated differently. Death as on the curving drive along Chapman's Peak that in Dulcie's imagining keeps her alive, and which in the reality of the text, one of the realities of the text, ends David's life. In that revisiting, we find the same turning road, the same lay-by. Entirely different, never meet each other again, but exactly the same image marks these two, the dying and the staying alive. Lay-by is such a beautiful South African word for something that is temporary and also permanent. In one case, also a very South African case, a lay-by is a financial instrument used by the poor every week, every month, to put away a small piece of money that eventually amounts to something large, something permanent, something complete. That is lay-by. But in a landscape, the lay-by is a temporary holding place when you pull off to the side of a curving road, like the drive on Chapman's Peak. You pull aside for somebody else to pass you, or you pull aside to park, in the many meanings of the word park in Cape Town, but just for a while. If you read Rustin Kuzain's extraordinary poem, Kingdom of Rain, something between the sky and the rain and the sleek road and time and hustle. On a lay-by in the mountain road, something happens that is unforgettable. So in a lay-by, you are there temporarily, and you are temporary, but something transcendent might happen. And I'm going to leave us there in the lay-by, left there in David's story, left there permanently in my mind. It was there, Zoe transformed me, and there she lingers with me, became forever in me. So there, facing the forever absence and the forever permanence, is where I'm leaving us at the start of this tribute to Zoë Wicomb. Thank you. And now, thank you. This is the sequence. Next, we will have a video sent by Sean Jacobs, who teaches at the new school. And then we'll have Angelo Fick, who will read a piece written by Dorothy, who can't remember who she is. Then a piece by Angelo Fick himself. Next will be Desiree Lewis and Lynne Brown. And then Gertrude Fester, who has part of time. And then we'll have a special section from the days of Zoe's friendships and teaching at UWC, where we'll hear from Mark Espin, Adam Hout, Carrol Clarkson, Hermann Wittenberg. We'll have an audio piece from Vlies, and finally we'll have Miki Flockemann. And we'll end with a piece of music that has been selected by Lynne Brown. And then we'll open to the floor for other deliberations from people who want to say something. So, and now over to Andre, and will help us to see the piece from Sean. Thank you.
Firstly, my condolences to Roger and family. I hope he appreciates my words when he hears them. I will read my tribute. Although I'd known of Zoë Wicomb for much of my adult life and admired her genius as a novelist and academic from afar, I only met her in person in 2006. At the time, I was in the second half of the first year of my first academic job as an assistant professor at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, public university in the American Midwest. I had helped organize a monthly speaker series called African Writers on Writing and Citizenship in the 21st Century. We had invited Fatou Diom from Senegal in France, Chimamanda Adichie from Nigeria, Besora from Gabon, and Zoe. My duties included hosting and introducing the writers. From the moment of her arrival, I felt a special connection with Zoe. Of course, I noticed her self-possession and intellect. She was so comfortable in that setting. Apart from the usual jitters, once she got going, her quiet confidence filled the room. Apart from a public reading, she gave a lecture to the English department that left everybody spellbound. But our connection ran deeper, though I only recognized it later. We shared something of a heritage, roots in the rural Cape. Zoe was from Namaqualand. My mother was from the Klein or Small Karoo. Her father was a teacher. My colored grandparents were farm workers. Like my mother, Zoe had gone to Cape Town as a teenager, Zoe to attend school, my mother to work as a domestic worker. Seeing Zoe's trajectory alongside that of my mother sharpened my understanding of what apartheid foreclosed for so many women of that generation. My mother, who died in 2020, was known for her intelligence and spirit. And Zoe's life illuminated not a contrast in talent, but the difference that opportunity or its denial can make. Figures like Zoe, along with others of her generations, Omar Bacha, Abdullah Ibrahim, Satima Benjamin, Neville Alexander, and Jabulo Ndebele, became for me emblems of the extraordinary effort it took to break through apartheid's constraints and the wealth of brilliance that could have been our collective heritage if those constraints had been just a bit less brutal. As I once wrote about Omar, their lives remind me both of what was possible for some and what was violently restricted for many, including my parents. Their resilience and brilliance thus remain a testament to the struggles and genius of Black people. But our friendship was not one of hero worship. It was an actual friendship. When Zoe came to New York City to give a reading, launch a book, or receive an award, she would often stay with us or book a hotel nearby in Brooklyn so we could spend time together. We have the pleasure of hosting Roger too. The same was true in Cape Town, where our paths often crossed. My daughter Rosa, who's now 20, called her Oma Zoe or Grandma Zoe. Zoe, her grandmother herself, loved that. One of my proudest memories was attending an honorary doctorate ceremony at the University of Cape Town. It was the first time since my days as a UCT student, and then briefly as a journalist in the early 90s, that I'd gone back inside what had once been called Jameson Hall, now fittingly renamed after Sarah Bartman, a Khoi woman who was displayed in Europe in the 18th century. That moment, Zoë honored in a space that had itself been renamed to honor a woman erased by colonialism, felt just right. Post-COVID, we saw less of each other, but we often caught up on the phone. We moved easily between Afrikaans and English, discussing books, cultural politics, her and Roger's collaborations with South African artists, and inevitably lamenting the lack of social and economic transformation in South Africa and the equally dispiriting politics of Europe and America. Much has been written about Zoë's commitments to nuance, to the intersections of race, gender, and power. But what I loved most was her clarity. She had little patience for pretension, and she could cut through the noise. I remember in 2022, she called to talk about The Promise, Damon Galgutt's Booker Prize-winning novel about a white South African family called the Swarts, or literally the Blacks. The book unfolds through a series of funerals, each raising the questions of the promise that the father had vowed to give the family's black servant, Salome or Salome, the house that she had lived in for most of her life. Some readers complained that the novel failed to give the other a voice, a criticism that many black South African readers didn't share, according to Zoë. She disagreed with the critics, and I encouraged her to write about it for Africa as a Country, the website I'd founded and was editing at the time. I was surprised when she said yes. She could have published her thoughts, anywhere. In her short essay titled Announcing the Reader, she argued that Galgutt's choice was deliberate. The novel she wrote holds up a mirror to white readers, showing them how they view their servants as silent and enduring. By withholding Salome or Salome's inner life, Galgutt confronts that blindness head on. As Zoë put it, and I quote, excluding blacks from narratology's implied reader is Galgutt's bold device for destabilizing such acceptance of post-apartheid culture, unquote. That was classic Zoë, sharp, brave, and generous in intellect. Finally, I wanted to end with something about Zoë's quality to listen and the fact that she really listened. Once, I told her a story from my childhood, how my father worked as a gardener for a white judge in one of Cape Town's wealthiest suburbs, and how I would go along with him on weekends and during parts of school holidays. Those visits exposed me early on to the city's brutal racial and class divides, and to the hierarchy embodied in the simple fact that my father had to call his employer master, and that he grew up 10 minutes from where he now worked before his family was forcibly removed after the Group Areas Act. A while later, Zoë told me that one of her short stories had drawn on that conversation. The story centers on the relationship between a white writer and the son of his gardener. In her version, the gardener, based on my father, is proud, defiant, and fully human. My father not as I remembered him, but as she knew he could be. That was Zoë's gift. She could listen deeply, translate lived experience into art, and return it with dignity. To me, she was a writer of rare moral intelligence, a mentor, a friend, and a link to a generation whose courage made so much possible. She taught me and so many others that stories honestly told are acts of resistance, of love. So may her words, her example, and her fierce clarity continue to guide us. Thank you. Rest in peace, Zoë.
Right, so I'm Angelo. I'll be reading Dorothy Driver's tribute to Zoë Wicomb, which apparently was read at Stellenbosch last week. It's an edited version. The edit was done by Gabeba Baderoon. So I'm ventriloquizing for the next few minutes. Zoë Wicomb was born in Little Namaqualand in 1948, the year the apartheid government came into power. Born to a mother whose last name was Lefleur, marking her French heritage and to a father whose last name, Wicomb, testified to his Scottish heritage. Her father, a schoolmaster in an Afrikaans-speaking community, sent her to an English medium school in Cape Town, after which she received a first degree at the University of the Western Cape, which feat she repeated a second Bachelor of Arts in England at Reading University in the early 1970s. Although she had made a marriage of convenience to a British citizen for the sake of a British passport, she entered a long-term relationship with the then budding but now acclaimed photographer and artist Roger Palmer, and embarked on a literary and academic career. The cultural boycott against apartheid South Africa meant that she could only make the briefest surreptitious return visits to her home country until the first democratic elections in 1994, and thereafter family concerns, her Scottish daughter, the then 3 Scottish grandchildren, limited the time she could spend in South Africa, though she taught for a while at the University of the Western Cape and made extended Cape visits. In the course of these movements back and forth between her 2 homes, the Cape and Glasgow, her writing developed what she called a shuttling movement between the 2, looking at the Cape with the eyes of an outsider, even what we may think of as an anthropological eye, and then also developing into what has become a familiar post-colonial response in which the centre becomes the margin, with Glasgow itself becoming her anthropological object, even while the 2 are strangely bound together historically and figuratively. This back and forth, this shuttling, this in-between, to and fro movement serves also as a more general description for her writing. Wicomb published her first book in 1987, an interconnected set of short stories which some critics have likened to a fragmented novel entitled You Can't Get Lost in Cape Town. A young woman is coming to age in an environment marked by the effects of colonization, apartheid. The book makes 2 fundamental assertions about place. First of all, by close and loving descriptions of Cape vegetation, and secondly, by allusion to the prior place represented in the opening stories by scores of children who squat unseen behind the chana bushes when the white government inspector comes, some of them taking the opportunity to, quote, empty their mouths, unquote, as the text politely puts it. The plant references are part of a larger set of environmental descriptors, variable land and the sky, so to speak. Wicomb's next book, David's Story, was published in 2000 and dealt in part with a complex history of the Griqua people, her family legacy, anti-apartheid resistance, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, through which was brought to light not just some of the horrors of the apartheid years, but also the hitherto hidden violence within the resistance movement. Here too, as in You Can't Get Lost in Cape Town, a key claim made by the book is the prior presence and land claim of South Africa's indigenous people. One of the central characters, Andres the Fleur, brings to our attention the quote-unquote amazed eyes of those who stand on the strand of that double-named place, the Cape of Storms, the Cape of Good Hope, watching the arrival of the first Dutch ship. The written histories that have come down to us have so far failed, as the Fleur knows, to record that sight through indigenous eyes. This is the gap that Wicomb fills in. There is a further point to be made about the place. Wicomb began writing Novel David's Story. She had written an optimistic essay, but at its end she voices anxiety at what she saw so rightly as a fragile democracy. The quote comes from Comment on Return to South Africa published in Kunapipi in 1994. She poses some key questions, and Driver quotes at length. How will military values acquired during the struggle be converted to civic values? Why does no one address this crucial aspect of reconstruction? Is the military not overrepresented in the new cabinet? Why is this so? Why is the obscenity of the apartheid government reproduced in the fantastic salaries drawn by our new members of parliament, while our streets are filled with homeless beggars? How long can we expect ordinary South African people to wait patiently for a better life? But then more optimistically, referring to what she saw as the ANC's firm commitment to mass education and raising levels of literacy, she imagines the creation of, quote, another generation of readers and writers, one that would now be attentive to the central position of irony and paradox in all aspects of our culture. David's story is, in the deepest sense, an urgent call for close attention, for continual interrogation, close reading of one's environment, political, cultural, economic, and the discourses that represent it and create it as what is then denominated reality. As mentioned earlier, Zoe was also a distinguished academic. She taught at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, producing some of the early 1990s essays, conference papers, and keynote addresses across the world, most gathered into a book called Race, Nation, Translation, edited by Angelo Fick, later, and published by Yale University Press, and locally by Wits University Press. Like other South African writers such as Njabulo Ndebele, Nadine Gordimer, John Coetzee, her fictional and critical concerns are visibly intertwined. This gives her fiction a particularly sharp critical edge. Apart from international success as a fiction writer, she was also, as Andrew van der Vlies points out, quote, among South Africa's most significant literary critics and public intellectuals. She addressed questions of genre, politics of representation, the role of intertextuality in cultural formation, the cultural and political importance of polyphony, the recovery of the voices of minor, neglected, and disparaged peoples, and perhaps above all, the importance of close reading, close attention to ambiguity, nuance, and uncertainty. It's hard to bear the thought of never seeing or hearing her again, but we can read and reread her. After David's story in 2000, she published Playing in the Light in 2006, a study of the playwright, a further collection of short stories called The One That Got Away in 2008, a novel called October in 2014, dealing with the complexities of dual belongings, the Cape and Glasgow, against the background of domestic trauma, and in 2020, Still Love. Of particular interest is her continued interest in how the past is to be remembered and how to counter memories might emerge, are always themselves to be scrutinized, as well as in the temptations and dangers of new nationalisms, new exclusions, new orthodoxies. But, says Driver, let me say a last word about her interest in place. The writing of Africa, her Africa, is crucial to Zoë Wicomb's lifelong project. In the words of one of her characters, quote, Africa brings the richness of posing new problems and new ways of thinking. Creative writing of the kind Wicomb did is like cultivation. To expand on the wonderful quotation, writing needs no more than a stick, and the earth God is given for the sowing of seeds. Writing is no less than cultivation and growth. The more you write, the more there is to write, and if the words themselves come bursting through the earth like so many seedlings. Thank you. So in that spirit of nuance and irony, I will read from Zoë Wicomb's first collection, You Can't Get Lost in Cape Town, and it's from the very last story in the collection, Gertrude Fester. The protagonist and her mother have gone back into the motherland, and they have proceeded to take a road along which they have encountered one of the sheep traders. They've had to sell skins to him. There's been a particularly racially racist interaction with the man who buys the sheepskins from them. And the two women have gotten into the car and they're driving off. We spread out our food on a ledge and rinse the tomatoes in a stone basin. The flask of coffee has been sweetened with condensed milk, and the Van Vredendal bread is crumbly with the whole grains of wheat. Mama apologizes for no longer baking her own. I notice for the first time a slight limp as she walks, the hips working evenly against the face of youthful eagerness as we move. And here, I concede, are the proteas. Busy bushes, almost trees, are plump out from the base. We look at the familiar tall chalice, leathery pink, and as we move around the bush, deciding, or we must decide now, whether the chalice is more attractive than the clenched fist of the implicated bud, a large and whirring insect performs its aerobatics in branches, distracting so that we linger and don't know. Then the helicopter leads us further to the next bush, where another type of plant grows. These are white protea torches glowing out of their silver-leaved branches. Flowers are open, petals separated to the mold of a cupped pan, so that the leathery parts quiver to the light. I wonder why the Boers chose the protea as national flower I use, and find myself humming mocking. Sacred Vosi Bolie, that's a and so. She harmonizes in a quavering voice. Do you remember, she says, how we sang all the hymns and carols and songs on winter evenings? You never could harmonize. Then, generously, she adds, of course, there was no one else to sing soprano. I do. We laugh at how we held concerts, three of us, practicing for weeks as if there would be an audience. The mere idea of public performance turns the tugging condition of loneliness into an exquisite terror. One night, at the power of her command, the empty room could become a packed auditorium of rustles and whispers. And around the pan of glowing embers, the terror thawed as I opened my mouth to sing. With a bow, she would offer around the bowl of raisins and walnuts to an audience still sizzling with admiration. And now, she says, I suppose you actually go to concerts and theatres. Yes, sometimes. I can't imagine you in lace and feathers eating walnuts and raisins in the interview. And your hair? What do you do with that bush? Some perfectly sensible people, I reply, pay pounds to turn their sleek hair into precisely such a bushy tangle. But you won't exchange your boskop for all the daisies in Mahalat. Is that sensible too? And you say you're happy with your hair? Always? Really? I think we ought to go. The sun's getting too hot for me. Down there, the earth is baking at 90 degrees. You won't find anywhere cooler than here in the mountains. We drive in silence along the last of the incline until we reach what must be the top of the cliff. The road is flanked by cultivated fields, and a column of smoke betrays a hidden farmhouse. So they grow things in the mountain? She says pensively. Someone once told me it was fertile up here, but I had no idea of the farm. The bleached mealy stalks have been stripped of their cobs, and in spite of the rows lean arthritically in various directions, the pickers have opened. On the other side, a crop of pumpkins lies scattered like stones, the foliage long since shriveled to dust. The fields stop abruptly with a felt resumes. Here the bushes are shorter and less green than in the past. The road carries on for 2 miles until we reach a fence. The gate before us is extravagantly barred. I count 13 padlocks. What a pity, she says in a strained voice, that we can't get to the edge. We should be able to look down onto the plain, the strip of irrigated vines along the canal, and the white door, and even our houses on the hill. I do not mind. It is mid-afternoon, and the sun is fierce, and I am not allowed to complain about the heat. But her face crumples. Her the trick is spoiled. Here, yards from the very edge, the place of her imagination is still not materialized. Nothing will do but the complete of the image of herself in the wicker chair, staring into the unattainable blue of the mountain. And now, for one brief moment, to look down from these very heights at the cars crawling along the dust roads, at the diminished people, at where her chair sits empty on the arid plain of Namaharat. Oh, she ought to have known. At her age, ought not to expect the unattainable ever to be anything other than itself. Her disappointment is unnerving. Like she paces along the cleared length of fence. She cannot believe its power when the bushes disregard it with such ease. Oblivious roots trespass the impunity and push up their stems on the other side. Branches weave decoratively through the diamond mesh of the one. Why are you so impatient? She complains. It's apple. Then you won't feel you're wasting your time. You're on holiday, remember? I am ashamed of my irritation. In England, I've learned to cringe at the thought of wandering about, hanging about idly. Loitering even on this side of the fence makes me feel like a trespasser. If someone were to question my right to be here, I shudder. She examines the padlocks in turn. If there were a possibility of picking, the logs. "We could climb easy," she says, "but I've no desire to." "Really? You don't?" She is genuinely surprised that our wishes do not coincide. I'll skip a bit, and then I'll go to the very end of the story. Later, I am woken by the sun creeping around to my legs. Mama turns out of her sleep when I enter the hut with a remaining coffee. "You must take up a little protea bush from my garden," she says as we walk back into the buggy. "If you must," I retort, "and then you can hoist the South African flag and sing Disdain." "Don't be silly. It's not the same thing at all. You who are so clever ought to know that proteas belong to the veld. Only fools and cowards would hand them over to the baboons. Those who put their stamp on things may see in it their own histories and hopes. But a bush is a bush. It doesn't become what people think they inject into it. We know who lived in these mountains when the Europeans were still shivering in their own country. But they think of the veld and its flowers is of no interest to me." As we drive back, we watch an orange sun plummet behind the hills. Mama's limp is pronounced as she gets out of the buggy and hobbles in to put on the kettle. We are hungry. We had not expected to be out till then. The journey has tired her more than she will admit. I watch the stars in an ink blue sky. The Milky Way is a smudged white on the dark canvas. The three kings flicker. The Southern Cross drills her 4 points into the night. I find the long axis and extend it 2.5 times, then drop a perpendicular, down onto the tip of the fifth paragraph, down onto the lights of the Suteris Moiner, due south. When I take Mama a cup of cocoa, I say, "I wouldn't be surprised if I came back to live in Cape Town again." "Is it?" Her eyes nevertheless glow with interest. "Oh, you won't approve of me here either. Wasted education, playing with dynamite. Ach man, I'm too old to worry about you. But with something to do here at home, perhaps you won't need to make up those terrible stories."
Yeah, I got to know Zoë over 3 decades ago, 3.5. Probably more than over 3.5, which I now realize is a really long time ago. As a student, a postgraduate student, searching for Black feminist writers, as an aspiring academic, and as a friend. So these roles weren't separated at the start, but were somehow always connected. I've realized now how much of a sort of type she's been for me, not a role model. Basically, I've been interested in October and exploring food smell. In our descriptions of cooking and references to food are connected to identity making, memory, and generally senses of both revulsion for or yearning for home. So what I want to do is read from October extracts on pages 194 and 195, which for me really bring this out. Back home in Glasgow, I won't bother to explain it as who, but you'll get the drift. Back home in Glasgow, Bush had no such misgivings about cumin and cardamom in a marble pestle for a signature dish of Moroccan lamb, having herself pickled the lemons, ported and salted, and packed snugly in their own juice some months before. Prayed, and I'm skipping a bit here, for all his bad temper, would be the life and soul of the party crazy husband of Mersha. He boasted about Mersha's Cape dishes, her use of spices, learnt, he announced to guests, at her mother's knee. Mersha did not correct him, did not say no, that she learnt from Jane Brinson's recipes, the invented English cook, who borrowed, gloriously freed by the fact that there is no oppressive tradition of fine British cuisine which demands slavish adherence. Instead, Mersha dredged up stories of the Lusitanian navigators, the Cape as refreshment station, the Cape of storms turned in the establishment of the spice route. Wimpel and Coriander brought to Cape shores in exchange for scurvy fighting, fruit and veg. Once she spoke of slaves from Goa, Malaysia, East Africa, sizzling their spices in the shadow of Table Mountain, which was not nice. So that Craig explained that Mercer had too much to drink. No one said that eating meat was not nice.
Just to explain Moroccan, how she made the Moroccan lemon. You put it in salt and you do this and you squeeze it tight into and you make a chicken. I don't actually know what I wanted to do. Look, there are a couple of family members who are listening, so I'm going to do something a little bit different. Because they did ask, are we not having a memorial for Zoe? I said, I probably Villada. Hi. Or they're all making sourdough because 2 years ago, they're all making sourdough bread. It was 2 years ago. She painfully typed out in my bedroom the recipe, the complicated recipe of sourdough, and handed it out to Khadija, to Tasneem, to Chandra, to everyone, and said, when I come back in a year's time, that's 2 years ago, and they got that 3 years ago, please make it. I don't know if I can do this actually. Achia Mercer says she relies heavily on Achia. There's little else to say. But then as she bites into the warm bed, she exclaims with delight, it's sourdough, isn't it? About the sourdough of the childhood. I believed it to be the invention of metropolitan master chefs. Yes, Silver says, if you like, got the better. She was the least educated in the family, but she got the better of Mercer, who was really educated and living abroad with an incredible accent. But Sylvie nailed Mercer around every corner. She relies heavily on. No. I've never made sourdough, Mercer confesses. She knows that this would please the girl. And this girl is 35 years old. And Mercer's brother's wife, so her sister-in-law. I've no idea how to make it, but you can buy a sourdough loaf. Expensive it is too at my local organic bakery in Scotland, which surprises Sylvie. She wouldn't have thought that country bread would be available overseas. It sets her off into explaining how some people use raisins, but that the ordinary potato makes for a better rising, fermented with less sweetness, although a teaspoon of sugar certainly hurries things along nicely. Look, she says, there's nothing to it. You boil the water, leave it to cool, and make sure it's still hand-hot. Then put in thick slices of raw potato, and I don't even peel it. In 3 or 4 days, or perhaps 5, there would be a grey fermented mess. And only then do you add flour and wait for... Mercer interrupts. Oh no, what a palaver. That's way too much trouble. The bread from my local bakery is very good. Even in the olden days, my mother only made sourdough when she ran out of fresh yeast. Then we shops because I lived in Beerstraat, this Mercer. No need to go to all the trouble nowadays. Sylvie looks at her askance. What a strange thing to say after she stayed up the previous night to knead and rose early to make a fire so that there'd be something warm for breakfast. Well, so much for the bloody woman's grandness for all that education. If she does not think that warm rooster brood is a treat, Why does she not at least pretend that it is? That's what she, Sylvie, would have done. That's how Auntie Ma had raised her. What on earth would she have to make for breakfast tomorrow if roosterbrood is not good enough? I did write a lot of things, but I'm going to just say a few things. You know, I sent my initial. I spent a lot of time preparing for this. So I sent my initial input to Desiree, and then I read it to Gertrude. And Gertrude said, "Oh, that sounds very academic. Why are you going to do that? It sounds like your work." And Desiree said, because I wanted to speak about the engagement to the roots, internalizing the homeland, the socio-economic context, pre and post, about the history of dispossession, all in the sourdough, the analogy of the sourdough. And I can't really celebrate her yet, because I think, like some of us in this room, we are still mourning her. I will celebrate her though, because there's a lot to celebrate about Zoe. Her last email to me was on the 13th of October in the morning. And it was the recipe of a food for sourdough bread. and around 5 o'clock she went to hospital. And at 6 o'clock in the morning, Roger called. And he said, "I phoned Hannah now, and I'm phoning you. And can you phone Gertrude? And I must phone Desiree. But Zoe has passed away." He said, "I bring bad news. Zoe's passed away." I said, "Oh, rubbish. She's dead, you mean?" That's what she always said. "Oh, rubbish. Why do people say passed away?" Because you see, you're lazy. You don't use language clearly. So it's hard to register her death. I think because she was supposed to stay this week at our house, I kind of see her around there, or I feel her around. Or some people say, and we planned lots of things. We planned her running away from the conference overnight at my house, and early in the morning we go to Home Affairs to get a South African passport. And I said, "You're 76, for God's sake. Why do you need a South African passport, so? This has traumatized us so much, because for 2 weeks she's spoken to me 3 times a day. Because she wanted to know, do you know where I'll get my South African?" I said, "We can go close to where I live. And we can go and get your passport in the mall." And she said, "Whatever for? Why would anybody get a passport from the mall?" So I said, "So you can't go by Uber. You'll have to wait for me to give you a lift." Zoe was so pedantic about food, actually. There was a Bergie who lived in a street in Observatory. Piet Skit.
Yes.
You remember? And Piet Skit used to walk past there very often. And Zoe used to say, before nightfall, she says, "I must get home. I must still give Piet Skit's food." And he gave her advice on medical things. He gave her advice on security, on raising a teenage daughter. Piet was and I looked out and I said, "He's a bad thing. Why are you giving the man so much attention?" And she said, "No, Piet has very good advice. And I use some of it, and you know it works." So Piet got a lot of it. So Zoe, in many respects, lots of people have had a lot of accolades for Zoe in the world, and yes, she's to be celebrated. But Zoe was a very keen listener. Zoe was a very good friend, an incredibly good friend, one who would make you say, I was accused of capturing the state, and Zoe did the whole thing of taking me through it. So what happened here? Did you do this? Did you do that? I just read this morning that happened. Somebody sent me this. How do you respond to that? And it was actually harder than going to Zondo. And at the end she said, let's write a book and tell that story. And so I didn't want to think like that. So yes, I do want to say that Roger, she had an incredible charm. She was curious. She was progressive. She was a snob, a horrible snob. She was very kind. She loved the problem to talk through, sharp as a razor, and she understood the world slightly differently. She was intense. She was a really intense friend. I would be terrified because I felt like this thing about baking a sourdough bread. It traumatized me every time she phoned because I thought she was going to ask me, did you finish? Did you make the sourdough bread? No, I didn't. I'm not going to do that. She loved being an Oma to Finn and Theo and Milo. She was a great partner to Roger and to Anna Fleer, whom she had her own daughter, whom she loved very much. Her brother Neil and her sister Mavis, who was a remaining brother and sister-in-law Mavis. Lynne, her niece, who she's very proud of. Bertie and Danny. Zoe's nephews and nieces always had a spot in her life. And then Frida, Vredendal. Sylvie will always get it right. Thank you.
I didn't know what to read, and so I sort of, glanced through things. And then I came across the passage, and it was just so nostalgic. And I heard about this word, but somehow I that word, and no one I knew actually used that word, but I didn't know that word existed. And then one day someone came to me, because I thought it was particularly Cape Town, Cape Flats word. But then someone came from the then Rhodesia and was really upset because they called it that word. So that was reported to me. So this is a short extract out of Friends and Goffles. Julie and Dot have known each other since starting at high school. In the hideous blazers of blue, green, and red stripes, with hats stuffed in their satchels, they waited for each other at the Weinberg station and, stripping ribbons of bark from blue gum trees, dawdled down the wide avenue in order to reach the school gates just as the bell rang. They walked close together, bumping shoulders. They'd have liked to hold hands. How often they talked about bumping school together, but they were not that kind of girls who did that, so that the detailed plans were kept open as possibilities, as dreams of freedom. On the second day at high school, just before registration, there was a charged, preternatural hush until the tall boy, Angus Guinness, scrambled onto the teacher's desk and, egged on by the others, made a formal announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, he said. Amongst them, there were a pair of Goffles, who it seemed were to remain in the A class. Imagine Goffles in the English medium Latin class. It was no doubt a mistake, and it was up to the Goffles themselves to check if they did not in fact belong with the other goffels in the Afrikaans median woodwork and needlework classes, right? Woodwork and needlework classes to be a goffel investigation. Each emphatic use of the word brought peals of laughter from the rest. If the girls themselves had not been sure what the word meant, each knew instantly that they were the goffles. So they kept their eyes lowered. In the class of posh colours, Dr. and Julie were the only ones who were very dark, had short frizzy hair, and flat noses with prominent cheekbones. Everyone knew the intricacies of facial features, and that good hair would always override the other disabilities. Dot and Julie did not qualify. Shame. So nostalgic. Because, I mean, this whole Afrikaans class, who does needlework, and who does woodwork, and who does Latin. And then I also had a very nasty cousin, and I think she was also very nasty too. Oh, I wasn't able to say that. Thank you very much, Gabeba, for the opportunity.
Firstly, good evening, everyone. Thank you to Gabeba, to Desiree, to Andre, and everyone else. I'm going to sort of do a rather oblique tribute to Zoe. And I want to read two poems by someone called Arthur Nortje, who was just 6 years older than Zoe. Followed to, maybe I can borrow your phrase, the lay-by, otherwise known as the clearing in the bush. Followed the same path or similar path. The clearing in the bush, we still have questions about, what we mean to do there, what kind of civilization is made to happen there, cultivation. The first poem is, two poems, one is more known than the other one. The first one is the lesser known one, it's called At Mowbray Waiting. A big red bus among the orange others makes splash of color here on this Cape Town afternoon under the groaning mountain. Sun makes me browner where skin lies naked. On gravel runs the tiniest laughter as wheels scatter crackles. And out of shade, I stir my sad little self from thoughts of Keats in the autumn on his sweet little island. My kind, and I mean Homo sapiens, weave in and out of unknowing subways under this black square of blonde Oskingdom, where summer journeys end in spasms. Awaiting my turn with this blood-red giant above the burr of engine, I hold a 5-cent passport to Athlone Desert. I have not been to London to announce my freedom.
First of all, I'd like to express my heartfelt condolences to Roger and Hannah and all the family. I hold Zoe more dear than I really know how to say. Now, I was in touch with Zoe just about a week or so before she died, and I'd sent a message to her just to say how much her writing meant to all of us at the University of the Western Cape. And through her work, what I find is that the students are able to develop a sense of critical confidence. I find them gaining in their literary agency themselves, and also their modes of engagement with Zoe's writing are just of such an extent that I can only describe it as life enhancing. And I'd also told Zoe that we were planning to hold a conference on her work in 2028, at least in part because the students are expressing such an interest in her writing and taking it on board as postgraduate projects. And Zoe said, oh no, you wouldn't want to have a conference just on my work. And she was a little bit shy about that. But it's only when I said to her, Zoe, this isn't really for you, this is for the students. And then she replied and said, oh, well, in that case, it's acceptable. So we will be going ahead in 2028 at the University of the Western Cape with this conference in honor of Zoe's writing. So I want to pick up where Angelo left off, and that is with the reading of the very last section of You Can't Get Lost in Cape Town. And one of the things that Zoe's writing has meant to me is this shuttling back and forth between two places. And for me, returning from the University of Amsterdam, where I worked for nearly 7 years, to come back to Cape Town, appreciating the difference between what it is to write about a place and what it is to write from a place. Now, the distinction is never quite that simple, and I think what we find in Zoe's writing is this contrapuntal inflection where things are never quite settled and yet they touch on the complexities of the thing. Now, on the one hand, Frida Shenton in the last story of a trip to the Gifberge in You Can't Get Lost in Cape Town, she says she hates South Africa, she's never coming back, and she has struggle hiding her revulsion when she gets given Proteas, the national flower, at the airport by Aunt Sissy. And then gradually things start to shift, and she has a dream, and her dream is of England. She has dreams of a wintry English garden where a sprinkling of snow lies like insecticide over the stubbles of dead shrub. And I had to laugh out loud when I read that passage, because in my view, snow is also overrated. Then she goes on the trip to the Gifberge with her mother, and right at the end of the story, she's seen all the beautiful fynbos there, and the fynbos just growing regardless of all that fencing with its 13 padlocks. They spend the night in a hut up in the mountains, and then Frida says to her mother, I wouldn't be surprised if I came back to live in Cape Town again. Is it? The mother says, matter-of-factly, but her eyes glow with interest. Oh, you wouldn't approve of me here either, wasted education, playing with dynamite and all that. And then the mom replies, ach man, I'm too old to worry about you, but with something to do here at home, perhaps you won't need to make up those terrible stories, hey? And on the one hand, we think, how can the mother say such terrible things to her daughter about her writing and her stories? But again, I come back to this contrapuntal view in Zoe's writing, and I have to say, I think perhaps there's a little grain of truth in what the mom says to Frida at this point, because it's this beautiful other home in England also, and in Scotland, first in London, but then the beautiful home in Scotland, in Glasgow, with Roger, that I think lends to Zoe's work this extraordinary complexity. So I want to turn now to another little passage where, if we've looked at the national flower of South Africa, the rose, which also defies all these significations of nationalism and seems to transcend them, I want to turn to the rose, the national flower of England. And here we have the little story, a fair exchange. And this is another thing that Zoe really loved, is flowers. So the protagonist in this story, her daughter, her name is Blom. And at the end of the month, the protagonist goes off to do the monthly shop. And as she's walking off with the groceries, the person in the shop unpacks a pile of enamel plates, and the tissue paper comes off, and there is this extraordinary, beautiful enamel plate with a rose on it. And even though the narrator knows that Skutterboot, her husband, is going to be so angry, she buys this beautiful enamel plate for her daughter. And it's a source of delight in the house. But then, because she's married to Skutterboot, the narrator, and Skutterboot is a shepherd, and the narrator has to become the domestic servant in Onoi Annie's house. And she's not happy about this. But then, on the first day that she goes to work in this farmhouse, we have this little passage. Onoi Annie had a rose bush right there in the middle of the veld, so that when she arrived at the big white house, she'd not minded so much after all. That was what a woman had to do. So perhaps the rose bush makes it bearable working in this house. But as she approached the house, there was the rose bush, blazing red in the sun. She smiled as she pored over it, its breath on her cheek, and looked up to see Onoi Annie smiling at her. Yes, she thought, it would not be so bad after all. Not so bad surrounded by these pretty things, for the curtains flapping in the window sent their printed pink posies spilling out onto the veld. Onoi was a smiler. Pretty roses, hey, she said. You can look after them if you like. Then she, Margriet, plunged both hands into the rose bush to cup for a second the scented redness, so that the Onoi shrieked, Mate, mate, pas op! Too late, she watched red blood trickle through her fingers, thinking, that is my new name, baptized in blood. Now that's a very complex moment and image, and again with flowers and all these, the ways in which Zoë Wicomb uses what Dorothy Driver has also called the poetics of plants to speak about characters at the deepest levels. But I want to come back to the roses, and I want to come back to those exchanges that I had with Zoe just before she died. And on a trip to the UK a number of years ago, I went and had lunch with Zoe and Roger in their beautiful, beautiful home in Glasgow. And it was the middle of winter, but there on the front stoop was this extraordinary white rose in full flower. In the middle of winter, there was snow on the ground. It was freezing cold. It was dark. And there was this radiant rose. And I spoke to Zoe about this in my exchanges with her just a week or two before she died. And I said, do you remember this rose, even though it was winter? It was November. And here was this rose flowering on your stoop. And Zoe replied to say that the indomitable rose is still there, and that she has a new rose too. And she wrote to me and she said, You should visit in the spring, when the garden is at its best. My new magenta rose, Thomas A. Becket, is stunning. And I'm left with this extraordinary image of Zoë radiating out from her beautiful garden with roses all around, even in the middle of winter, even as winter is approaching in Scotland. There will be Zoë and our memories of hers bringing brightness and light and beauty into all of our worlds. Thank you.
Mark Espin has been teaching one of the stories from the first collection of stories, Clearing the Bush, to third years. Those are about 250 students. So every year more than 1,000 students encounter Zoë's work. Going back the last 4 years, that's almost probably 5,000 young people who read Zoë Wicomb. We hope they read Zoë Wicomb, and a lot of them do read Zoë Wicomb. And I would like to say this is not just Zoë's legacy, but this is in a sense Zoë making a mark on the future of this country. The lives of literally thousands of young people. Playing in the Light, by the way, is also a novel which has a little cameo scene involving Clark's bookshop, the place where we are now, when the character Marion wants to, in a sense, open herself up to living, and chooses to do that via books. And she goes to this bookshop, and I think there's Henrietta there, she's not mentioned by name, who then gives her a number of books which she should read, right? But here's the thing, I think to all of those who are teachers, and to those who teach at universities, teaching a novel year after year after year again can produce a certain laziness or boredom or sort of repetition. Here we go again. But my experience has been in teaching Zoë's texts year after year for the last 4 years or so, was that every year I had to rewrite and reconceptualize, rethink these lectures, because every time you see new things. And I think that is what makes Zoë's writing so extraordinary, such great literature, like that we read it anew every time. I come then to the second and last part of my little contribution here, not teaching Zoë Wicomb, but being taught by Zoë Wicomb. And here I go back 30 years. I think it was around 1994. The country was changing, going through a transformation. And I also felt, being a young white teacher at a very conservative school in Goodwood, teaching English, an all-white school, I also needed to change myself. So I enrolled for an honours degree at the University of the Western Cape. And this was an extraordinary experience. I was in the same class as people like Zaki Ahmad, Kay Jaffa, Antoinette Klute. A year later, Adam Haupt and Soraya were in the class. So it was an extraordinary shift and change of worlds, and these have marked me very deeply. And among my teachers in those years were not just Miki, who was here, Desiree, you were also there in the English department, but also Zoë. And I think reflecting back on that time, I suffered from a fatal combination or flaw. I was beset both by an incredible naivety coupled with arrogance. And I must say, in retrospect, if we are honest, it was probably a white naivety and a white arrogance as well. And sitting in Zoe's class on feminist literature, feminist African writing, I must have been very irritating to her. And I think it was probably the second seminar, she cut me down to size very formidably with her tongue. I got a very sharp rebuttal. She really cut me. But I think also, to be generous, I think there was also, coupled with her sharp tongue, a twinkle in her eye. Right? And I think these encounters, shaped by Zoe, but also by Miki, Desiree, and others who are no longer with us, set me on a journey in life which I'm still walking on and which has transformed my life. So that is my debt, my enormous debt to Zoe, who was also my teacher.
I am coming to you as a voice from the future and from the past, recording this in Australia at the end of your day, which is still to run to its end. What to say that might not already have been said? What to say that we haven't all thought already? How we've lost a mentor, a sparkling interlocutor, a friend and host, a giant. The thing I want to remember, and this will be a repetition, is generosity. The generosity not only of a host, though especially that, over meals at a glass table in a yellow kitchen in the East End of Glasgow, but also a generosity reflected in quotation, homage, intertextuality. In recommendations of this book you must read, so we can talk about it. In that spirit, here are two short extracts from two books that came to mind when I wondered what on earth I might say that could be better said in words I know Zoe herself read, many times in one case, perhaps spoke, perhaps read aloud. First, from a novel whose most famous dish I know she wanted to recreate, perhaps did, though not for me. I avoid beef. You'll know why else this book feels so apt. From chapter 14 of its first part, The Window. As they turned by the crossroads, he thought what an appalling experience he had been through, and he must tell someone. Mrs. Ramsay, of course, for it took his breath away to think what he had been and done. He would go straight to Mrs. Ramsay. She made him believe that he could do whatever he wanted. He had felt her eyes on him all day today, following him about, though she never said a word, as if she was saying, "Yes, you can do it. I believe in you. I expect it of you." And so turning into the lane that led to the house, he could see lights moving about in the upper windows. They must be awfully late then. People were getting ready for dinner. The house was all lit up, and the lights after the darkness made his eyes feel full, and he said to himself childishly as he walked up the drive, "Lights, lights, lights," and repeated in a dazed way, "Lights, lights, lights," as they came into the house, staring about him with his face quite stiff. But good heavens, he said to himself, putting his hand to his tie, I must not make a fool of myself. And then, from the epilogue of the last book Zoe recommended to me, almost precisely a year ago, Georgy Gospodinov's Time Shelter. Novels and stories offer deceptive consolation about order and form. Someone is supposedly holding all the threads of the action, knowing the order and the outcome, which scene comes after which. A truly brave book, a brave and inconsolable book, would be one in which all the stories, the happened and the unhappened, float around us in the primordial chaos, shouting and whispering, begging and sniggering, meeting and passing one another by in the darkness. The end of a novel is like the end of the world. It's good to put it off.
I'm actually here for David Atwood, who was supposed to, so I'm not David Atwood. Thank you for taking us. Just in case. Yes, I mean, thank you, everybody, for all the wonderful things you've said. And, you know, it's been a tribute and mourning. And I thought that I would end maybe on a lighter note, just some memories of Zoe when she was first at UWC. So from the outset, and you know, in our department, from the outset, Zoe undoubtedly created an intervention in our department. Fiercely rigorous and expecting the same from students and colleagues alike. Her ironic reposts and razor-sharp tongue that we've heard a lot about already periodically had one cringing 1 minute and laughing out loud the next. I recall having to bring my extremely wild and then white-haired, so her hair was also wild, 5-year-old daughter with me to campus one day, and as Zoe and Chiara were walking hand in hand together in front of me, a student stopped and said amiably to Zoe, "Is this your daughter, miss?" In response, Zoe looked at him incredulously and snapped, "Don't be ridiculous," and marched on while he was left looking after her nonplussed. At the same time, as mentioned by so many already, she left a deep imprint as a mentor on many Black women scholars and emerging writers and students during this period, and so many of you have spoken about her as a mentor. Zoe also infused our somewhat drab and teaching and office spaces with her signature style from the 1950s and 60s type dresses she wore with such flair, to her distinctive voice and form of address, which we've also heard about, so I'm repeating quite a few things. Since we lived around the corner from one another in Arbs, and in fact Zoe mentioned to me little David's story, Gabeba, you mentioned the black-eyed Susies, which she always called black-eyed Susies, that they come from, that she said was, they were in our garden, and she remembered, she wrote about that. And we shared lifts. Unforgettable too are the conversations and on the trips to campus. And when it was Zoe's turn, it was her antique but elegant little dark green Morris Minor. Zoe bravely clutching the steering wheel tightly at the top with both hands, close together, while negotiating the occasional goats or horse and buggy along what was then Modderdam and now Robertson Bookway Road, after the days when that road was the locus of standoffs between protesting students and police during the states of emergency in the mid-1980s. That is, until one night she woke up to the sound of her precious little car being driven off at top speed by a canny thief, straight off to Salt River. Colleagues, and this is what she said, colleagues and students will remember that Zoe had a sign that read, "Gone fishing." I don't know if you remember that. She had this big sign, "Gone fishing" by a chicken man in Kize in her office. It always seemed odd because Zoe was such a damn hard worker. The other side, yeah, anyway. So she left it with me when she went back to Glasgow. But I hope to return it to Roger when he comes, because it seems that the last bit of writing to be published by Zoe is an essay on Chicken Man for a book edited by Roger that has just been launched. Well, Roger and somebody else, I just forget who the other person was. And in the book, it does feature that sign, because Roger asked me to send a photograph of it. Zoe famously loved light, from the warmth of the sun on her skin to the play of light on walls and trees, and that's also been mentioned. She often said at that time, in the 1990s, that she really craved the light of this home when she was away from it. But in fact, to her friends, she was the source of light. always up for good food and wine, and we've spoken a lot about that. And I must say, I do remember the chicken she actually served that in Glasgow to us, the chicken with the lemon inside. Yeah. And always ready for a party, as long as there was dancing and stimulating conversation. And I think it's no surprise that at a gathering, an informal gathering of her friends in the week that she died, and it ended with dancing. Later in her home in Glasgow with Roger, she made a remarkable garden of vegetables and flowers that were very different to those that she grew up with in Vredendal. Seeing her there, in that environment, made one feel that was also home. So rest well, Zoë.
Swaar gekry in hierdie eysterplek, want hier is almal gek. Ek wil net huis toe gaan, onder die bittermaan, agter die einders ver, waar die bokke blaar, na die boere blaas, want dis my kop wat raas. Ek wil net huis toe gaan, ek wil net huis toe gaan.
Ek is te lang in die stad, ek wil die lampad vat. Ek verlang na jou in die o hemelblauw. Ek wil net huis toe gaan, onder die rieldansmaan. Aan 'n watersloot wil ek kaalvoet loop, daar waar die grensstraat sing, dis mos die beste ding. Ek wil net huis toe gaan, ek wil net huis toe gaan. En die wind omdraai, en die windjie waai, en die hane kraai, en die boere saai, en die lammers vee, en die trekkers ry, en die boervrou kry aan die boer se tyd. Ek is so moeg van die stress, ek is nou oud en bles. Nou wil ek ophou werk en my tas uittrek. Ek wil net huis toe gaan, daar langs die akkerlaan. En hierdie donker land het ek 'n toekomsplan, en die neon skyn deur my siel se pyn. Ek wil net huis toe gaan, ek wil net huis toe gaan. Ja, nou die boereplaas, want dis my kop wat raas. Daar wil ek staan onder die rieldansmaan. Ek wil net huis toe gaan, ek wil net huis toe gaan, ek wil net huis toe gaan, ek wil net huis toe gaan.
Is there anybody else who wants to say something before we repair to the other room where Clarks has kindly given us some libations, as there should be at a memorial? Anybody else wants to say something about
Hope there's some bread there.
we'll hold Clarks to account. If not, I want to say as well, to the people who are watching online, among them, I think Roger Palmer, and possibly Helen Fleur Palmer, and Espin, Theo, and Milo, whose names I knew, and because Zoe spoke about them so lovingly, always. And to everybody there who are with us here, also thank you for coming. And thank you for creating, I think, a very beautiful tribute to Zoe through her words, which are the things that we will have forever. So thank you very much, Desiree, for sending that initial email. It just gathered us here. And to everybody who has spoken so unforgettably. And to our friend, our forever person, to Zoe. Thank you.